Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Tom Hahn from NPB, and I have the pleasure today of introducing our Storer lecturer for the Major Issues in Modern Biology series, Dan Rubenstein. Dan has a long and distinguished career. I will not go into everything there is to say about it, but he's been at Princeton University ever since about 1980, which is a long time. And he was initially in biology, and then when it turned into multiple things, ecology and evolutionary biology. And he worked his way up through the ranks there to his current position, which is professor and chair of ecology and evolutionary biology. He also, I noted on his website, is the class of 1877 professor of zoology, which I think reflects how long the university has been there, not how long Dan has been there. But Dan, as many of you know, has been a fixture in the international evolutionary behavioral ecology world for many years. He studied everything from sunfish to zebras. And I think, as many of you know, he has sort of a unifying thread in the research that he does in combining theoretical and empirical approaches to try to address basic conceptual issues in behavioral biology. And these days, he's particularly interested in decision-making in animals, and I think we'll hear a bit about that today, especially with regard to foraging and social interactions and mating behavior. And another thing that I think is really noteworthy about Dan is that he carries on a long tradition that's been present at Princeton for many, many years of bringing to light fundamental conceptual things that have bearing on conservation-related issues. And it's about these sorts of things that I think we're going to hear the most about today in his talk, Balancing Conservation and Development in Africa, Lessons from Kenya's Savannas. Dan.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, everybody, for coming. I'm really delighted to be here, and what I'm going to do today is talk about one of my passions, which is using fundamental basic biological principles to address issues in conservation and management. And I'm going to do it with these two wildlife species. One, the plain zebra, which is fairly common in all of Africa, and the Grevy zebra, which is not. So they represent two species that share a habitat, and share a habitat with people that are trying to make a living. Very poor people whose lifestyles really do need improving, and the consequences of that could be very deleterious on these two species, especially the Grevy zebra, which is only about 2,000 left on the planet. My aims today, ultimately, are to illustrate how science can play a role in conserving and managing zebras to enhance economic development. And I'm going to use three case studies, which is to look at the financially well-off middle class, the commercial ranchers, and look at how they view wildlife on the landscape. The financially strapped, or the smallholders, how they can profit. And lastly, by those that are truly challenged, the traditional pastoralists. But before we can do this, we have to back up and address what are the real issues facing both the people and the wildlife. And before we do that, we're going to have to learn something about basic biology and zebras. So let's start with zebras. There are two species that inhabit East Africa, especially northern Kenya. The plain zebra, the guy with the fat stripes that touch under the belly, and the Grevy zebra, the guy with the thin stripes with the white belly. What's interesting about them from a biological point of view is their social systems are very, very different. The two species share the same genus Equus. They have the same body plan, the same tooth structure, basically the same digestive system. So they process food in the same way. They're sympatric on this landscape in northern Kenya, and yet their societies are very different. If you're a behavioral ecologist, the foundational view for our studies is that the environment shapes behavior, and that the nature and the distribution of critical resources, be they food, water, safe sites from predators, they will determine how females respond to the ecosystem, and then consequently how males will respond to females. And we start with females because females ultimately outcompete other females to spread their genes into future generations by being better parents, by garnering resources in the right way, staying alive, producing offspring, and launching those offspring into future generations. The males, on the other hand, increase their reproductive success by gaining access to reproductive females. So it's the female decisions that ultimately determine female associations and distributions on landscapes, and males respond to those. So if we understand how females perceive a landscape, and how they use it, then we can sort of understand why two societies are different. The plain zebra society is one where females bond to a male for long periods of time, sometimes their whole lifetime. And it's the uni-male, multi-female group or the harem group. The Grevy zebra have a different system. Females don't associate with each other for particularly long periods of time. Female associations are ephemeral, and they periodically come together, they fuse, and sometimes they separate and they fission. And so you get a fission-fusion society where membership in groups is transitory, which is different from that of the plain zebra, where females are in one group for long periods of time. The relationship here between males and females is strong, and the relationship between males and females is very weak. And so why are these two tattoos branded on the sides of the animals different? Well, to address that, we sort of look at what are, in fact, the benefits that females get by associating with the male. And what happens is females are very, very choosy because males provide material benefits. The sociogram, which is just a picture of the relationships between females and females, between males and females, sort of looks like a wagon wheel, where the male is at the hub and the spokes are the relationships that tie the females to the male. And they're very, very strong, whereas the relationships among the females themselves are much weaker. And the reason that this social system develops is because the resource that the zebras, both Grevies and plain zebras, consume is grass, and grass is a resource that's very permissive, in the sense that it does not engender much competition. Here we can graph group size of a harem group against the percentage of time that females spend grazing, and there's no statistically significant relationship, certainly not a negative one, which would imply competition. So the resource is permissive because the animals can space themselves out. This grass blade is not much different than that grass blade, and if it gets too congested, you can just spread yourself out on the landscape. The consequence of this, however, does not explain why groups form, and it doesn't explain why groups should form with tight cohesion. Dick Alexander was the first to note in the 70s that there are no automatic benefits of group living. They're just automatic detriments, especially of disease and parasite transmission. So if groups are going to form, there have to be benefits that offset even these minimal costs. And the reason that groups form in the plain zebra is that males provide protection from other males and therefore increase the foraging success of females. It's a system where young males, are bachelor males, because you have your one male attached to females, there's a bunch of failed males out there that put pressure to garner matings with the females. Males that don't herd their females, tend to be dominant or high-ranking males, whereas low-ranking males herd their females about. So if the intruder male comes into a vicinity where there's a harem group, and if you've got a low-ranking male you're associating with, the first thing he does is round you up and move you out of harm's way. And that has this very negative consequence on your foraging success. Whereas if you're with a dominant male, or a male rising quickly in rank, then he goes out, greets the other males, and pushes them away and lets the females graze. And this grazing comes out to about 6 minutes more per hour. And since these animals graze about 20 hours per day, that's about 2 hours difference if you associate with a dominant male as opposed to a subordinate male. And the consequence of that is if we use lifetime reproductive success as indicated by number of surviving foals per female that make it to the age of independence or 1 year of age, females that associate with high-ranking males do better than females that associate with low-ranking males. So females are very choosy. They look for the guy who keeps them out of harm's way by keeping other individuals away from them and giving them freedom of movement. Now, this type of society not only pertains to the plain zebra, it also pertains to horses and mountain zebras. So now we have a conundrum. If males are so valuable and they provide extra time for grazing by not sexually harassing their own females, then why is it that the other species of equids, the Grevy zebra and the wild asses in the really arid conditions, don't adopt this pattern of social organization? And the reason that they don't is that the different classes of females cannot bond with each other. The species that have the closed membership harem groups are species in which food and water are close together. So females with different dietary needs can meet their needs simultaneously by staying in the group and getting the benefit of the male's protection. When food and water are scattered, then females that have young foals that need to drink and they have to drink every day, are stuck near water, whereas the females that don't have foals and need to drink every 3 to 5 days, they can wander off in search of high quantities of vegetation far from water. The poor male now is stuck because both classes of females are equally valuable to him. The females that have given birth will have a postpartum estrus, and the females that haven't given birth will cycle every 2.5 weeks. So what's the poor male to do? The male sort of gives up and sets up territories around where the females are likely to be or where females are likely to come and go. And you can see that distribution that tears the social fabric right here. If we take random points on a landscape as the dry season progresses, those random points, when measured to the nearest distance, nearest point of water, tend to increase, the distance between a random point on the landscape and a watering point. The non-lactating females distribute themselves more or less like random individuals on the landscape. Females with young foals less than 3 months of age, however, are found significantly closer to water than either a random point or a non-lactating female, and that's what tends to tear the social fabric, that females can't stay with each other, and so the males set up territories to mate with both types of females. The dominant males set up their territories near water and get access to both types of females, and the subordinate males that are still able to set up territories do it in the upland areas and gain access only to the females that don't have young foals. So you move up the male hierarchy, you move closer to water. So those are the fundamental points of the biology of the two zebra species. And we're going to see that they'll come back to inform us about the problems the animals are facing and what we as managers or conservationists can do to use that information to start to address policies and changing human behavior so that people's livelihoods will improve as well as we can sustain these populations. So now, what are the problems facing people and wildlife in northern Kenya? Is it possible then to have eco-friendly development? Well, here are some data on the economic circumstances facing the people of Kenya. Here's the data early on, right after independence. These are the various sectors. But if you just look at the gross domestic product, it was ripping at 6.6% right after independence. You can see under Moi's regime, the numbers decline. And then just before the violence before the last election, the numbers were improving. In 2006, Kenya's economy was really humming along. So it's a country that has natural resources. It's a country where wealth can be generated. But the key is not everyone in this country benefits by the economic engine that some of the people are experiencing. And the pastoralists are the people that are benefiting the least. Why is that? Because pastoralists live directly tied to the land, and their behavior leads to the tragedy of the commons. That the greedy gain for a while, but mutual ruin eventually comes to everyone if you keep putting more animals on your landscape. You are personally induced to add an extra cow, because if you add an extra cow, you get the benefit of that cow, and the costs are amortized with everybody in the community. But if you get to put that extra cow on, why can't I put that extra cow on? And then you want to put the extra cow on. The next thing, everybody puts an extra cow on. The benefits now are shared, and the costs are shared, and your landscape falls apart. And so Garrett Hardin was the first to really note that to solve this problem, mutual coercion has to be mutually agreed upon. And of course, the devil's in the details of how do people show self-restraint by their own behavior? How do they mutually coerce each other? We often do it in the West by having governments that pass laws that tell us what to do. And so democracies do it that way. It's not clear how pastoral peoples do it. And so the solution in part will depend on better understanding the dynamics of these livestock on the landscape. We might be able to use our science to be able to create innovations in various strategies of using the landscape, but it's ultimately going to also depend on addressing the human nature problem, how people behave. Ultimately, we have to change people's behavior. Now, what are the problems facing the wildlife? If we just look at the Grevy's zebra and the plains zebra, you can see their historical ranges were bigger than they are today. The Grevy's zebra has always had a restricted range in northern Kenya, Ethiopia, and Somalia, but the plains zebra has ranged all the way down East Africa into South Africa as well. The light colors just demonstrate today's range, and you can see the populations are becoming fragmented, especially for the Grevy's zebra, where there's one small population of about 100 left in Ethiopia and about 1,900 in the northern parts of Kenya. Now, the two species are responding very differently. Even though the plain zebra's populations are being fragmented, they're doing quite well, especially in Laikipia. Over the last 20 years, the numbers have gone up. The Grevy's zebra, on the other hand, the numbers in Kenya have gone down. When I started studying them in the late 70s, there were about 1,500. Today, there's about 2,000. And even on the Lewa Conservancy, where there have been no cattle until very recently, the numbers were increasing until 1999, and then even without cattle, the numbers have been declining. So there's something going on for this species on a landscape where the plain zebra flourish. The Grevy zebra, even when there's no livestock, are not doing particularly well. So we want to try to find out what it is that's causing those problems. Now, the question about livelihoods being enhanced and wildlife being conserved has been typically dealt with in the West, especially in the United States, in a very simple way. Wipe out your wildlife, develop your land for economic benefit, get wealthy by industrialization, and then use that money to rebuild your ecosystems to include the wildlife that you wanted. Okay? And so, Little Red Riding Hood didn't like her wolf, so wolf goes bye-bye. And you end up creating reserves. Now, reserves themselves have a huge dynamic. So that you set up an area, you gazette it, it's going to be a reserve. In reality, it becomes a reserve. Development takes place around it. So your reserve is good, but it becomes an island. There are issues of island biogeography, and some species will go extinct. Certainly, populations will shrink. And reserves, although they've worked in the past, may suffer as range boundaries change due to climate change. So reserves have been useful. They still always will be useful, but they're not going to be necessarily a panacea that work for all species, especially big-bodied species that range widely. So, is there an alternative? Now, we can look at the problem in the light of environmental Kuznets curves, where we can measure environmental harm as a function of per capita income. So as people develop and get wealthy, they often impact the landscape negatively until they get to a eureka moment where they start investing in improving the quality of water and air, and then the harm goes down. But it tends only to be rich societies that have lots of income that tend to fix the problems that they create through industrialization. If we put on the normal transformation of what societies go through, you can see when agricultural societies are very basic, their impact on the landscape is very low, but so is their per capita income. It's through rapid industrialization that you transform the landscape, and you do so often by harming water and air. And it's only after you turn to a service industry that, in fact, you start to see improvements in the quality of air and water, because you invest for quality of life reasons to clean up the messes you've made in the past. The question then becomes, can economic growth happen without environmental degradation? In other words, can we go from this portion on the curve straight over to here, where the impact of people on the landscape is low, but the income on a per capita basis remains high? That's the question. Can we do that? Can we do it in a non-Western way? Well, I think the answer is yes, and I think it's yes in a particular place, because Kenya represents an opportunity to try for an alternative route, because 70% of Kenya's wildlife lives on private lands. Now, we work at the Impala Research Center, and there are a number of people in this room that also do projects there as well. And that's right dead center in Kenya, near Mount Kenya. And this is the Laikipia governmental district, the Isiolo district, and the Samburu district. And you can see the Laikipia district has a lot of colors for the multiple land use schemes. So the pinkish colors is agriculture. It's non-irrigational agriculture. The water for that agriculture comes from the water towers, if you will, from Mount Kenya, the Aberdares, and the rising rains from the Rift Valley and the escarpment. The yellow represent large commercial ranches, and the light green represent group ranches, where pastoral people live with their herds, where they've become basically sedentarized by the government allowing people to take title deed of size parcels of about 15,000 acres, which is too small for a pastoral community, because they're too small to capture the rainfall gradient, where they would move the animals from one grazing area when it's dry to another grazing area where it might be raining over here. So the sedentarization and the maintenance of the lifestyle itself becomes sort of a problem. So it's an area ripe for modification of the traditional grazing system? And can we do it in such a way that increases the payment from wildlife so that people are encouraged to change their attitudes and values about wildlife so wildlife will stay? We're going to look at three scenarios because we really have three stakeholders on this landscape. We've got the fairly well-off, the commercial ranchers that own ranches of about 50,000 acres, and they try to make a profit by their cattle ranching. We've got the financially strapped, the smallholders that have anywhere from 50 to 5,000 acres, and then you've got the financially challenged, the traditional pastoralists. And we'll look at these two cases first, which are generally white ranchers of some sort living in the Laikipia region. So we're going to first looking at sharing the rangeland between wildlife, in this case plain zebras, and livestock, in particular cattle. And we're also going to look at the sustainable culling that the smallholders used to be able to do under government aegis, where there were no markets to sell the animals, but you could use the resources for your local feeding of your dogs, which you need if you're a pastoralist, and also to feed your workers. So let's start with the financially well-off, the commercial ranchers. Here we're asking the traditional question: can people that have cattle and livestock share their rangeland with wildlife, or do they fear that wildlife will eat the grass that the livestock needs, so there's competition? We argue that also it's a possibility for facilitation, that the sharing of the landscape by two different body type grazers would in fact lead to an improvement of the performance of each species. And what we've done is we've set up experiments, our so-called cattle-donkey project, between herds of cattle that we raise alone with other cattle, herds of donkeys that we raise with other donkeys, or mixtures of donkeys and cattle. And this is based on the DeWitt diagram approach to understanding competition. Plant ecologists have known this for years, that you grow crops purely, species A and species B, and look at the performance, and then you grow mixtures. If the line attaching the two is straight, then they're substitutable. If the line bows down so that the performance in the mixtures is less good than the performance in the pure, then it's competition. If the line bows up in the mixtures, then you know you've got some sort of mutualism or facilitation. We use donkeys rather than zebras because donkeys we can purchase. They will live with the livestock in mixed bomas where we can keep them together. And more importantly, they don't run away from us when you're on foot. And as a consequence, we can watch exactly what they eat, just like we can watch what the cattle eat. And they will work together in herds with our herders. Now, we boma-ized them, put them in corrals at night in mixtures, and these animals then lived apart from all the other animals, were walked along roads where they couldn't eat, into their experimental plots, which were huge. This is about 4.5 square kilometers of experimental area. And then they grazed all day, were walked home at night, drank at night, as opposed to at midday, which is what the pastoralists normally do. Every 2 weeks they were weighed, going through a box, which I'll show you, and scales, and we collected their poop in order to measure their parasite loads. We also measured what they were eating in terms of the bites and the species they were consuming and the greenness and the brownness, and we were able then to measure the weight change over time. Interestingly, we did two stocking densities. A high stocking density of one animal per 2 hectares, which is what the pastoralists stock their landscape with, and one animal per 7 hectares, a low stocking density, which is what the commercial ranchers stock their land with. And as I say, these experiments ran for 6 months. Okay, so they started off right after the heavy rains, they went through the summer light rains, they went through the dry season, and then it started in the short rains, the heavy rains that occur in December. So these experiments went for 6 months. We also measured the impact on the habitat, but I won't talk about that today. This is our cattle donkey team, all high school leavers that were literate. Each one was assigned to a particular paddock of animals, either pure cows, pure donkeys, or mixtures. Every 2 weeks they were forced to go through this box that was lifted up so we could measure the weight change of the animals. And these are the results, quite striking results. The mixed herds are in gray, and the single pure herds of either cattle or donkeys are in white. And if you look at the live weight change throughout the 6 months of the experiments, the animals that were raised in mixtures outperformed the animals that were raised in pure stands, be they donkey pure stands or cattle pure stands. So very strong results in terms of performance on the animals, either our surrogate zebras or our cattle. How did this come about? Well, the mechanism is related to feeding. This is the bite rate per minute of the animals. Again, in the mixtures, they're foraging better than they do in the pure stands. So we've actually looked at what they're doing in order to get that high bite rate. It's a rather long story. What happens is their diets are shifting. The shifting diets are affecting each of the species. And the take-home message is that sharing seems to be possible because the cattle's benefit in two ways. First, by increased access to bulk, and by increasing quality of the vegetation that they have access to. The increased access occurs because donkeys are shifting to the relatively abundant Setaria grasses, cropping them down and changing the structure of the vegetation, so that the cattle, which use their tongues to pull, find it easier to feed on the food that the cattle like after the donkeys, with their teeth, clip away and change the height of the vegetation. So the donkeys open up the rangeland for the cattle. They also change the quality of the food, because not only do they focus on Setaria, but they focus on the two Pennisetum species, which by themselves are usually low quality in terms of protein. But once they chop down the Pennisetum, and we have the light rains taking place during the summer, 50 millimeters of rainfall in July and August, that changes the crude protein mix. So the cattle, which are very sensitive because of their rumination strategy to changes in crude protein, all of a sudden have a mixed of diet that is higher quality than they normally would get by sharing the rangeland with the pseudo-zebras, the donkeys. Now, the donkeys, being throughput feeders with a hindgut fermentation system, this isn't as important. And so the major changes that benefit the cattle are associated with donkey feeding and changing the available food for the cattle. The donkeys benefit because the livestock in some way act as a sponge and take away all the parasites that the donkeys have. The donkeys tend to have, from lay-well, I'll show you some data in a moment, about 2,000 eggs per gram, which is way above the threshold that tends to harm perissodactyls. And in the mixed plots, the parasite level drops by 35% in every treatment, well below the critical threshold of about 1,500 EPGs, which is where stress occurs to animals. The numbers were in the 1,000 to 1,100 range. So the presence of cattle act as a sponge that take away the parasites, especially the strongyles that the donkeys are harmed by. And so we see that the mixtures, by different mechanisms, benefit both the livestock and the donkeys, which are our surrogate zebras. So from a commercial rancher's point of view, sharing the landscape is mostly good in years where you do have dry periods and rainy periods. When you've got droughts, probably nothing is going to be good. But in years where you've got the natural mix of rainfall, dry season, wet season, the presence of the two species together, especially at the high stocking densities, which is going to help the pastoralist, is going to make a big difference. So now let's look at the smallholders. As I said, there was some natural culling, and can zebras be culled sustainably in ways that would enhance the economic livelihoods of these smallholders? Well, we can test the effect of culling by using population projection matrices, where in this case it's a stage-specific matrix where we have infants, juveniles, adults, and we forecast the numbers in these categories from this year to next year by this matrix of fertilities and survival terms. The survival terms and the fecundities are all density dependent in our model, and the age of first reproduction here for the juveniles is also density dependent. And when you put this model into tune this model with the parameters of the vital rates that we get from our mark recapture studies, you can see that zebras, thank you, can take care of themselves. That 30 years out, if you start with a population of about 30,000 plain zebras on Laikipia, which there were when we did this model in 1999, the numbers will increase slowly to about 45 to 50,000 over 30 years. So the population can do quite well in Laikipia by itself. Now, the government allowed culling, And they, in fact, allowed culling up to 15% of the population. Now, fortunately, Kenyans are not very efficient at culling, and so when they culled at 10%, the population would be extinct in 30 years. 10% is too high based on our modeling effort. What we do find, though, is if you allow 6% culling, numbers will drop from 30,000 to a new carrying capacity of 25,000, but that'll be okay. And so, ecologically, some limited amount of culling, both males and females at a 6% level, will be ecologically sustainable. But now we have a caveat that gets back to biology. What have we learned about the social system of zebras? The male is a critical hub to the society. Well, when you start hunting, okay, certain ranches where animals are hunted, in particular the males, and the reason males are hunted is because male skin is black and white, female skin is brown and white, black and white skin fetches a higher price. So everyone hunts males one way or the other. And on ranches where you've got hunting of males, the cortisol level of the survivors goes up. So there's stress in the population. And quite interestingly, it is the female survivors who have their stress levels going up, which means their reproductive success is going to be potentially reduced. And the reason for that gets back to our basic biology, that it's a wagon wheel type of social system where the male is at the hub. When you knock this male out, especially if it's a breeding male, then the females no longer have that protection, and everybody starts to harass the females to try to incorporate them into their harems. Their foraging rate goes down, their cortisol levels go up, their body condition goes down. And I would think that even this 6% culling probably needs a safety factor of another percent. But still, you should be able to cull. Well, culling isn't economically viable. It certainly is ecologically sustainable. So here we do some simple calculations, and I put in a slide here of zebras in the fog because these are sort of back-of-the-envelope calculations based on a number of assumptions. Laikipia is about 10,000 square kilometers. There's about, on our model, 25,000 zebras under a culled situation. That would be the carrying capacity, which would lead to a density of 2.5 zebras per square kilometer, or if we converted it to acres, about 10 zebras per acre. If we take a small holding at about 5,000 acres, then the expected number of zebras wandering through that holding throughout the year would be about 50. If you then allowed 6% culling, that would mean each smallholder would be allowed to take 3 zebras. Now, is the glass half full or half empty? Is that going to be a profitable solution to the problem or not? Well, the economics are such that a zebra is worth about $250, not very much. There's no market for the meat. The meat can be given away, but you can salt the skins. And if you salt the skins and get a Kenya Wildlife Service permit, you can export it to South Africa, where the skin will be tanned and sold to you, the tourist, with papers for over $1,000 per skin. So the real money goes to the South Africans, not to the East Africans. So a zebra on average is worth about $250, which is the same price as a cow. So a zebra and a cow are about equivalent in their value, which would be about $750 a year. And depending on whether the rancher pays his staff $2 or $3 a day to be a herder, the amount of money would spread over either 9 or 12 months of wages for one worker. So is that a lot? Is that a little? It's in the eye of the beholder. It certainly is some economic value. Probably not a lot, but on the margin, enough probably to make wildlife pay and presumably to stay. So from the commercial ranchers and the smallholders, we can see that the wildlife has economic benefit that may, in fact, allow them to stay. And the plain zebra is not threatened. But what about the financially challenged, the pastoralists? Well, to understand their economic plight and their relationship with the Grevy's zebra, we have to back up and look at the biology of Grevy's zebra and to understand why these numbers have declined, and especially when there's been no effect of livestock. Because the usual explanation is, well, it's the people that have caused this decline. And that would be holding true if it weren't for the fact that after 1999, on the Lewa Conservancy, the numbers have gone down. So we set out to look at Darwin's hostile forces, competition, predation, and disease. What role do they play in controlling Grevy's zebra numbers? And then we look at people and their herds. What is their effect on top of these natural factors if they play a role? And so we know on conservancies the following. One, competition is real. Plain zebras do outcompete Grevy's zebras and not vice versa. So if we look at the number of plain zebras locally, the proportion of plain zebras locally, and what I mean by locally is that when you get into an area of about a hectare and you've got a mixed herd of Grevy zebras and plain zebras, what is the fraction of species A and species B there? And as the fraction of plain zebras goes up in that mixed herd, the Grevy zebra intake rate, their bite rate, goes down statistically significantly. When you flip it around and look at populations in mixed herds where Grevy zebras are outnumbering plain zebras, you can see that as Grevy zebra numbers increase, there is no statistical impact. There's a lot of variance, but there's no statistical impact of the presence of Grevy zebra and plain zebra. So you've got asymmetric competition where the abundance of plain zebras can start outcompeting Grevy zebras. Now, has it always been this way? Probably not. And the reason is Grevy zebra's historical range was further north than the areas where plain zebras was abundant. And that's been over time. There were no Grevy zebras on Impala or even on Lewa 70 years ago. Now Lewa has 400 Grevy zebra, the largest population on private land anywhere in the world. They've been moving south. Is it climate change? Is it pressure from people? We don't know. But as they move south into the area where food and water are more contagious, you're starting to see plain zebras outcompete Grevies, which may have been the ultimate reason that set the southern limit to the Grevy zebra's range. So we're seeing that play out. We also know that predation has an impact on Grevy zebras and that lions prefer Grevy zebra over plain zebras. Now the way we found this out is we collected the dung of lions and we sorted the hairs out of the dung. And you can identify zebra hair, not surprisingly, because the medulla is solid and black, whereas the bovids, there's usually breaks, and that's what gives the hair the light tan color as opposed to the black color. So you can tell bovids from zebras, and you can tell the difference between a plain zebra and a Grevy zebra by the size of the medulla relative to the cuticle. That, in fact, Grevy zebras have larger medullas, larger black bits. They're wider, a greater proportion of the hair, than plain zebra. And when you look at all the hair in the dung, so you take 20 hair samples out of each dung, you find that 93% of the lion scats, and we use 50 lion scats at 31 different kills, 93% of the lion scats contain zebra hair. 68% of the scats with zebra hair contain Grevy zebra hair, and 56% of the zebra kills are just solely Grevy's kills. Now, on the Lewa Conservancy, there's 400 Grevies and 1,600 plain zebras. So if lions were hunting randomly, you'd expect a 1-to-4 ratio. In fact, we get pretty close to a 50-50 ratio. And so this is highly statistically significant that they're disproportionately feeding on the Grevy zebra. Now, why are they feeding on the Grevy zebra over the plain zebra? We don't know the complete answer. Grevies are 50% larger, so they may be a preferential item in the diet. But there's one thing about their biology. Males are not around. Males are wandering in search of reproductive opportunities with other females that are straying into their territory, and they're driving out cuckolding males. So by and large, females and their youngsters have no male present, whereas in the plain zebra, the male is present. And so perhaps the social system difference is leading to the difference in the survival of predation. Now, why then is the Grevy zebra suffering today? Was it suffering in the past? They're coming into new parts of their range where lion densities are higher than in arid areas, and they're also flourishing in conservancies where tourists like to see lions as well as Grevy zebra. And so the tourism is encouraging higher density of lions. And so if you look at Lycipia in general, Lawrence Frank and Rosie Woodruff's data, you see that lions are 6 per 100 square kilometers on the commercial ranches that are unfenced in Lycipia. On the conservancies, it's 30 per 100 square kilometers. So it is 5 times as high, the lion densities. And this is where this data comes from the Lewa Conservancy. The last of Darwin's hostile forces is parasitism. We saw that the critical threshold was 1,500. You see even the plain zebra is above 2,000 where there are no cattle. So the cattle look like they are a sponge where they do coexist. But the Grevy zebra are not being as heavily parasitized by strongyles as are the plain zebra. So of the 3 potential guns, 2 of them are smoking, competition and predation, but probably not parasitism, leading to the harm naturally to Grevy zebra as they come south. But what about people in their herds? Does livestock ranching by the pastoralist change Grevy's zebra natural behavior? The answer is yes. You can see a fence here. But even without a fence, herds monopolize water all day, livestock herds. We know from our conservancy studies that both plain zebra and Grevy zebra prefer to drink when they're free to move about on their own between 9:30 in the morning and 1 in the afternoon. If these herds are monopolizing water during that time, which of course they will because a pastoralist moves them from the boma at dawn to water at midday and back to the boma at night, then during the peak preference time for Grevy zebra, the livestock are hoarding the water. And if you bomaize it with a fence and protect it at night from the zebras coming in, then they don't even gain access then. So we wanted to test this hypothesis. And so we employ scouts. Now, we've created the scout program courtesy of the American zoos. The American zoos that have Grevy zebras in their holding fund research that benefits the people by hiring them to be scouts. The scouts go out and site the Grevy zebras. They fill in check sheets, and they record first the GPS location, because we give everybody a GPS. They record the cloud conditions, the rainfall, the openness of the landscape, the presence or absence of water, the presence or absence of other wildlife, the presence or absence of livestock. But most importantly, these little icon pictures here are of the different age and sex classes of Grevy zebra, and then they record the number that are standing, walking, or eating. Now, we hire both men and women as scouts. We do that because, A, we want to distribute the wealth equitably in the society, but more importantly, from our behavioral point of view, our data gathering point of view, is men are herders, and they go onto the open landscape with their herds. Women collect firewood and water, so they tend to be in the more closed habitats. So we wanted equal coverage by habitat. And then we take all this data and analyze it, and then we have workshops. And we always have the scouts present the rationale and the workshops with us. And one of the scouts, this is not Maria, but Maria, when she gave her talk at Sarah Lippe, she started by saying, I now understand my zebras. So you engage the people and empower them, and they start to believe the results that we share with them, because they've gotten the data, we just do the analysis. And so they earn income, but because they're part of the process, they're poised to gain even more. Now, they make $3 a day. They were originally working 1 day a week, and the women came to us and said, can we work 2 days a week? So St. Louis Zoo said, sure, you can work 2 days a week. So they make $300 a year in a part of Kenya where there really is very little cash economy. So this is a huge amount of money. The women in particular spend it on their children's health care and schooling, and so the money does increase the quality of life for the next generation. Now, this is the typical results that we got before we started the project from the first year of data in 2003, 2004. Early in the morning, the herds are basically solitary individuals, and those herds aggregate throughout the day. When we talk at the workshop, they go, of course they aggregate at night because there's lions and they need to protect themselves against predators. And everybody knows that's true, so that's a given. So they like that. They feel proud of that. But then we ask them, well, why is it early in the day the herds are tiny? And the first thing that happens is the men scream at the women, because they sit in different parts of the workshop. You throw sticks and stones at them because you don't want to be near them when you're getting firewood and water. And they go, that's true. But you men, you put your dogs on them because you don't want them near your herds. And they start screaming at each other. And everyone admits and laughs that, yep, it's human behavior that breaks the herds up early in the morning. But more importantly, why is it in late afternoon the herds are large? No lions are active. And this is when they look at their feet. They know the reason. It's because their herds are monopolizing the water all day, and they don't want to talk about it. So the elder one day at one of the workshops says, okay, we'll go home at 4:30 rather than 5 o'clock, and we'll give them an extra half hour grazing. So we actually never resolved this problem, and I fretted on what was going to happen. It turns out the whole problem has vanished. It's vanished in a very clever way, and I'll get to that in a moment. We never had to have a further discussion. And part of it's because the people's behavior changed in so many ways. Another thing we saw, this is females without young in Swahili, and females without young, these females here, if we make the assumption this dark speckled area is the higher quality vegetation, and this lighter area, which looks darker here, is the low quality vegetation, the livestock monopolize the high quality vegetation, and only 30% of the sightings of Grevy zebra, especially females without foals, are seen with livestock. 70% are seen without livestock on the lower quality vegetation. And we show the people that and we talk about it, but this is what the data is. In fact, you've got 30% on average, and your non-lactating females and your territorial males are even lower than that. So we present the results to the communities, and we then start to give the presentation the second year, and we start with this. And the Marani, the warriors at one of these workshops, jumped up and said, "Professor, we don't do that anymore." And I said, well, you know, I can test this. I got next year's data in the computer, and I'll go home and I'll test it. And sure enough, 50% of the sightings the next year, 12 months later, are the females, all categories on average with livestock. So this is what the landscape has changed. So the distribution by time of day is completely changed because they have changed their attitude towards the animals. They share the water with them. And so the animals aren't pooling at night in large groups that everybody said was because of lions. They're not necessarily in bigger groups in the afternoon than they are in the midday or in the morning. So every part of the day, they're more evenly distributed in their herds. So in 12 months, just the change in their tolerance, their attitudes, changed their behavior. So we never had to revisit the discussion about how to let them share the water. They now share the water. And this is your typical sighting up in Samburu. Where you see the cattle, you see the Grevy's zebra. 5 years ago, you'd never see a picture like this. The dogs and the people would have shooed off the Grevy's zebra. Here they are grazing together. So it's a much healthier picture, but it can only be a beginning. And the reason it can only be a beginning is we're only paying 3 families out of 500 in these group ranches that are benefiting economically. It's a drop in the bucket. It's a stone in a pond. It's a ripple that's leading to change, but it's not necessarily going to provide the wealth distribution that's going to stabilize the sharing of the landscape. And the area we work is a really interesting area. It's right on the area of emergency and high warning of food security status. During this study between 96 and 06, we've had 5 droughts, 1 El Nino flood, and all of this has led to tremendous overstocking and overgrazing. So despite all this harsh conditions, what's been happening is people have been able to move their herds onto lands that no one is occupying. So herds haven't necessarily shrunk during the droughts. And as a consequence, herd size stays large, and it leads to overgrazing. So this is the area where we're working, right on the edge of these 2 worst-case scenarios where we're always facing food security problems. So the question is, how can we affect behavioral changes on a large scale that benefits a larger fraction of each community? And I would argue that it comes again from better science. Better understanding of animal movements, better understanding of the water cycle, because that's what drives the behavior of zebras, but it also is responsible for the relationship between livestock and zebras, and better education. And all 3 are woven together. So we now can put radio collars on the livestock just like we've been doing with the wildlife. And so we can monitor the movements of these guys simultaneously with the movement of our 2 zebra species. And here's just some data for repeated for an area where we were testing some collars. The animals were in a boma right on the southern boundary of Impala. We put them on at the spray race here where there's a corral where we could put the collars on. And day 1, they marched them back to the boma at night. And what's really interesting, they drank at an area called High Dam. This is day 1's route, day 2's route, day 3's route, and Truman, day 4 route, right around your clay plots, okay? Right on the boundary. So they just avoided your area, a long day's journey. But what's really interesting is they are doing a very optimal routine. They are grazing one area, going over 250 meters, grazing another area, 250 meters, grazing another area. Then they move around Truman's plot and graze another area. They don't retrace their steps. Now, Impala is kind of special because we have one ranch manager. He controls all the cattle. He's got a dictatorship. He doesn't have the tragedy of the commons with everybody doing what everybody wants to do. And so the question is, can our understanding of livestock movements in relation to zebra movements be understood on these group ranches of Ilmotiak, Tiamamut, and Koija, which bound the northern part of Impala? What's interesting about this area is it's the same climate, but it's also the traditional old elephant migration route. So it's got some precedents for possible other wildlife movement areas. So we've started the Owasso Water Project, which integrates hydrology, ecology, and people's understanding of politics, how they govern themselves, so we can get basic data, which we're in the process of doing, so we can create spatial models for forecasting how the animals use the landscape so we can possibly intervene, much like we did with the population projection modeling for the culling experiments. And so we can work with the people for sound governments and land use plans, hopefully to improve their lifestyles and conserve wildlife. So this is work in progress, and our logic is this: that there's climate change taking place which affects the water cycle, water affects the vegetation affects the animal movements, and that affects people and their policies. Now, there are always feedbacks going down, which we're looking at, but also notice we're also looking at the people's impact and decision-making, both on the interplay between livestock and wildlife and their effects on the vegetation. So here's some preliminary data. Trenton Franz is one of the eco-hydrologists in our project, and he's been able to document from 65 years of records that short rains and long rains, the total rainfall hasn't changed. Laikipia is getting the same amount of rainfall, but the rainfall per storm is going up, and the frequency of storms is going down. So the spacing between storms is increasing, and when it does rain, it rains harder and heavier, which means less infiltration, more runoff, more erosion, and if there's been overgrazing, then you're going to get gullies and ripples and everything else that destroys the landscape. We've also been able to do the hydrology on the vegetation per se. So evapotranspiration here as a function, it's negative, so you're losing the water, of a variety of different vegetation types. Bare soil, not surprisingly, it dries out the fastest. Grass dries out slower, but interestingly, not statistically significantly different from the area underneath Acacia mellifera. Now, Acacia mellifera has the same shallow roots that grass does, but Acacia tortilis has a deep taproot, and it holds on to water more, and in fact could be seen as a water pump that would hold water and bring it up to the surface, which could provide some of these feedbacks on water flow, certainly could affect both the mellifera and the grass development. Because if you've got grass, then as water runs down, it slows down and infiltrates. And so all of these feedbacks could be important. And Trenton now is going to be building some of these forecasting models to look at how, under different grazing regimes, the water cycle changes so that we can actually see how the forest-grass mixture changes over time. We've also been looking at the grass per se, and we use these production cages that Truman knows all too well here, that you put them over 1 square meter, and you can measure the growth of vegetation inside and outside. And most of our group ranches have set aside 20% of their land as conservancies, where they don't let livestock in to graze unless it's a drought. So they're not complete conservation areas, but they're areas that are less hammered. And if you look at the growth of the vegetation over 3 months in the conservancies between inside and outside, and you can't really see a difference between the red and the blue line, it's not that difference in the conservancies, but you get a lot of grass growth in the conservancies. In the grazing area, where people live and where they graze their livestock, inside the cages, the grass grows better than outside the cages. But interestingly, the long-term chronic effect of grazing depresses the ability, even inside cages, of the grass to respond to exclusion of the livestock. We've also seen that under trees and outside of trees, there's a difference in terms of the amount of vegetation in the conservancy versus in the grazing area. In the conservancy, the grass does better in the open areas than under trees, but there's a strong statistically significant interaction that in the grazing area, under trees, the grass does better than out in the open. And in part, that's because the thorn scrub could be acting as barbed wire. It could be because the trees are acting as water pumps. They could be slowing down the penetration to increase the infiltration. We don't know the exact mechanism, but we do know that if you don't charcoal, you'll have more trees, you'll have more grass in the grazing area. These are issues we can talk to the communities about. We can demonstrate that behavior of people matters. We can also look at how they graze on their grazing lands. So we can look at the livestock responding to the grasses and what impact they're having. So this grass here is average height by Julian date, and this is during the light summer rains. And what you see is the grass doesn't grow. That the people are managing that grass, cropping all the growth. You don't have any net production. But what surprised us is post-summer rains, before the December short rains, when it's dry, that's when the grass grows. So the people under normal conditions where there's dry periods and rainy periods, they maximize the offtake during the light rains. But as soon as it dries out, either because the livestock are spreading out or they're moving them more quickly, the grass actually has a net growth effect. So our pastoralists are not necessarily always harming their landscape. The grass is regenerating in normal years. Now, during drought years, that's when you could have problems. We've also been able to look at how our wildlife are using the grazing lands. And this graph shows you something very interesting. Grevy zebra do use the grazing lands. They're in there like our donkeys and could have a positive facilitatory effect. What's interesting is they don't use it when the livestock are active, but they use it when the livestock are in the corrals at night or before they come out at 7 o'clock in the morning. So the Grevy zebra slip into the grazing areas, use the grass, which has been hammered but is growing and highly digestible, and people manage their water better when they share it with their livestock. So the water pools that they dig are deeper and cleaner, and the Grevy zebra are using that water. And so the Grevies are using the lands managed by the people and possibly providing the feedbacks that we saw would be beneficial to commercial ranchers. And lastly, we're now starting to interview the people and study their behavior to look at their roles of sanctioning when people cheat on the conservancy, formal versus informal. We're looking at how scarcity affects their property rights. Are they going to keep the group ranch, or are they going to break it down into individual properties like they're doing in southern Kenya? And we're also looking at decision-making and herd movements in terms of day-to-day decisions on where to go and the composition, the mixture of cows and goats, to look at that impact on health of the children and the adults. So we haven't yet gotten very far on the human side, but those feedbacks are coming. That's what we do with the adults. The last bullet point was education. And this is where we're looking at the next generation. We go and take our results to the communities and share it with the adults, but we also go into the schools and we share the results of the Grevy zebra, but also talk about broad conservation ideas. And once when we did this in the Nagaroni community, one of the headmasters came up to me and said, "It's nice that you come and do this, but my teachers don't understand conservation biology, they don't understand environmental biology, what are you going to do about it?" And so the St. Louis Zoo, San Diego Zoo, and 5 other zoos raised $50,000, and we had workshops with the teachers and, most importantly, community liaison members, because the Kenya government will change teachers from school to school. So as we educate the teachers on conservation biology, the next thing we know they're in Mombasa, they're not in northern Kenya. But if you've got parents who have been to high school and they act as the teachers' aides, they are the continuity that can work to educate the teachers about the local issues. So we've had meetings with the teachers and their liaisons to create conservation clubs and a curriculum for the clubs. And we give out certificates, because you got to always give a certificate. And in fact, one of our teachers got his certificate, quickly went to Nairobi and got a job in an NGO as a conservation expert. So there is the law of unintended consequences. But by and large, these certificates give people value in their communities. They become ambassadors for this type of thinking. And the conservation clubs basically do experiential learning, much like we do in the United States, because the Kenya educational system is one of repetition and memorization. And this gets the kids up and active. And we have scientists and their assistants. This is my son's assistant, and most of you know Katie Prager, who's working on jackals, coming in showing how she traps jackals, why she traps jackals. And we also play games. This is a game called On Guard, where they actually have to understand the trade-off between feeding and vigilance for protection, why animals live in groups. We also take them on bus rides where they see wildlife and describe what they do, learn their natural history. This little boy here is picked out of a hat, become a zebra dust bathing, and the students have to guess what he does by rolling around in the ground, so that reinforces understanding the behavior of the wildlife, because we take it for granted that we see this wildlife when we're there. They don't. They're in their little villages. They can't walk around. They don't have access to buses. But Impala's bought a big bus, and they go and see the landscape, and the bus is now going out to our 3 communities that we've brought these clubs in, not only to the Impala school, but the Ilmodiak school, the Koija school, and the Tiamamut school, the primary school. So we're trying to educate the next generation. So we certainly can use science to improve the herding practices today. There's no doubt that we can do that. The feedbacks already are having big effects and benefits on the wildlife, especially Grevy zebra. But is that sufficient? 3 employees in a group ranch of 500? I don't think so. Are they going to adapt the patterns that we talk about? Probably, but will they destock? Will the landscape recover? Possibly not. Are there alternatives? People always say ecotourism. Well, there's no infrastructure here, but let's say there was infrastructure, like there is around Ilingwesi, which is partnered with Lewa Conservancy. It turns out that ecotourism, the big panacea, is probably not a long-term solution, because Ilingwesi had a net profit of $36,000 last year. There's 600 families. That's about $60 per family. That's not going to go very far if you treated families as individual stakeholders, but they don't yet. The individual stakeholder concept is alien. They work as a collective, so that money does go for schools, goes for health clinics. So it does benefit them in aggregate, but at some point they're going to want refrigerators, motorcycles, and cars like everybody else. And then, is that going to be sufficient? Education. We do raise money. Most Stanton has raised a lot of money for the school bursaries for the Impala kids, and they go to high school. It's kind of sad when they come out of high school. There are no jobs. And they come to me when we set up the conservation clubs, and they sort of say, can you hire me? And they're wearing a white shirt, and they look impeccably dressed, and they don't want to be herders anymore. They're not going to be herders, but they have no jobs. So is the education that we're funding the right education? Should they be learning Shakespeare? Or should they be learning trades to generate enough wealth to send back to the families? Don't know the answer, but are we doing the right thing? And where are these jobs? Where are people going to get jobs to earn income to send back to their families? They have very strong loyalty to families. But if only one child goes and gets a job, family tax takes away that wealth. What presence and ambition do they have to work hard if, as they make more money, more of it goes to a larger number of kin back in their family, in their tribe? Where is this middle class going to come from to generate the wealth to push the large part of the population past the demographic transition? So we as scientists are doing better science. We can communicate with people, but we also have to do better networking. We have to build connections. Certainly from the science point of view, I hope I've convinced you that it's not just the natural sciences that most of us do. We have to partner with engineers, ecohydrologists, and social scientists to understand what motivates people to coerce themselves to avoid the tragedy of common. But we also have to find ways to spread the wealth. And so my aim in talking today for how science can reach out to people to do good, how basic science can change behavior on a landscape that is fragile, is that conservation and management actions will only be sustainable if local communities, and that can be the large commercial ranchers, the smallholders, and the pastoralists, believe in the goals of our research, that they'll actually understand and use the science in ways that will transform them so that they can understand the value of the emerging knowledge and put it to profitable use. If we can do all of that by using good science and communicating it, empowering people to participate in that science, so citizen science in the broad level, be they kids or adults, we have a chance to lead to long-term solutions. And it means we have to work outside of our natural sphere of the academia. We have to start talking to corporations. We have to talk to governments to be able to provide stability so that corporations come in and provide those meaningful jobs, not the menial jobs, for the people, so the wealth can go back to sustain these women in particular who are making decisions on child rearing and making decisions on how to feed their kids and therefore healthy communities. Thank you very much. Take questions?
In the parts of Kenya that you worked in, is there a human population problem of increased human impact, just people?
More people. There's always the problem of more people. Okay, that's sort of the big elephant that aid groups and NGOs really don't talk about, is that the birth rate's high, and you're trying to move people past that. Women don't want to have as many children as they've been having. Okay, if they can voluntarily get access to contraception, they will. And part of educating women is that while they're in school, they generally are not going to have children, but when they come out of school, they're also going to reduce their family size. So there is an issue of that, but that is something that's very hard for people to deal with. We're dealing with on the ground, the more proximate level of what are these goats and cows doing? How many do you need? What can we do to better husband them without cutting down on their welfare of the people? If people's livelihoods are improved, then they'll pass the demographic transition naturally. Well,
You were talking, Dan, about the group ranch and the tragedy of the commons phenomenon, but you mentioned in southern Kenya, they're apparently starting to break up the group ranches into individual holdings with their own problems. What's your read on that?
One of the things, a lot of this research is coming from a program called Grand Challenges at Princeton. And Grand Challenges, our trustees, they give us lots of money, although they probably won't give us lots of money this year. And the Grand Challenges program has been very powerful because it's supposed to bring students and faculty together and do research that really focus on translating science into changes in human behavior. And so the Grand Challenges, one of the requirements is that we teach a course. And so we taught a graduate course on water, savannas, and society. And so we had a number of visitors come and talk to us about water issues on their landscapes. And we had a woman from Kenya. And she's been studying this problem. And she shared with us some fascinating stories from her analysis. So let me share some with you and the rest of the community. Because if northern Kenya, which has more aridity problems than southern Kenya, were to go this route, it could spell a disaster for this landscape. So what's happened in the group ranch law is that if 65% of the community votes to disband the group ranch, they can get individual title deed to a small holding inside the collective. So there have been a lot of negotiations down south to move the community past the 65%. And in the Kajiado area and in the Amboseli area, a number of the group ranches have done this. So what happens when they do this? Not too surprisingly, the powerful who push for it, miraculously, it's supposed to be random, get the best plots of land, the most productive plots of land near water. And what are they doing? They're converting the lands into agriculture. Okay, we were talking about this last night. And agriculture generates more wealth than pastoralism ever will. It's a natural transition. So if they do that, some families are going to do better. But what happens to all the families now who still have livestock who are having trouble getting to water, are on the less good land? They have banded together to create group ranches out of their individual title deeds. So they're now, those group ranches were small to start with. Now they're smaller and fragmented. They almost look like fractals and snowflakes. But the law also guarantees that they have access to water, so they have to have easements across these croplands, much like in England, footpaths can go right through farm fields because they're enshrined by law. So where this is going to go, we don't know. But what's interesting is the disadvantaged have collectivized again to try to have large enough holdings to do the reciprocal relationships that are so necessary. Okay? So, but that works where there's water and where there's agriculture. And so maybe this isn't going to happen up in our area because with non-irrigated farming, agriculture is probably not possible. And so there'll be less pressure by the haves to push for the dissolution of the group ranch into private holdings. But we should be vigilant to that, to see what's going on. That's where the people policies, feedbacks. And that has, Jonah Western has seen the change on the wildlife. So it's much harder for zebras and the wildlife to coexist now on these lands where there's this breakdown in the collective from his flights and stuff like that. So the individualization and the mixture of agriculture just intensifies the human-wildlife conflict, which makes it harder for wildlife to coexist.
You mentioned tourism, affecting animal populations. Tourists want to see more lions, for example, and you think tourism brings in money into the area. Do you see negative impacts on certain animal populations because of the tourism? And
well, one of the things that other people at Impala are studying is the lelwel, which is a genetically different and possibly different species of hartebeest. And in Kenya, it's very rare. And the hypothesis that have been generated, is it disease and parasitism? Is it predation? And where they move low well populations into fenced areas, just qualitatively, not looking at the statistical analysis, the low well seems to thrive. Whereas when they stay in areas with lions, the low well goes down. So again, the low well, the Grevy zebra seem to be harmed by this increased density of lions. Now, should you worry about the low well the way you worry about the Grevy zebra? This divides the conservation community because low well is common in the rest of West Africa. It's just in Kenya, at the edge of its range, it's not doing well. The Grevy zebra is not doing well universally. And so one size need not fit all. And this is where we as conservation biologists have to work with government and people to be sensitive that over making grand claims for preserving everything in all space is going to have negative consequences for people. There's got to be some sort of sensitivity and trade-offs, and we're sort of exploring that intellectual space now to see what can be done.
You introduced the idea that typically societies get wealthier, we have an increase in land degradation, and then that declines. In a society where wealth tends to be converted into livestock, what are your thoughts about the possibility of transitioning to a wealthier society while minimizing degradation?
Right. So there's a generational divide that the parents really want the cows, and the cows generate the 10 that the son needs to buy a bride. So cattle in these cultures is wealth. It's like money in the bank, and it's used in a very specified way for rituals and for reproductive success, which is, of course, evolutionarily interesting to us evolutionary ecologists. But the herds are changing. There's fewer cows and there's more goats. There's also more camels. Camels are having a major effect on the browse, which has never happened before. But the movement from cattle to goats is interesting because goats are like your ATM machine. That's what you sell to the butcher for cash. That's what you get your $30 for your goat. And you don't sell your cow. So they're almost into a dual economy now by mixing. So they are moving their portfolio, if you will, to such that they can have more liquidity and their cash. So the younger generation is much more sensitive to having cash, so they can have the Walkman and the phone and the paid, to top off their phone. So they're much more want to become the Western society. And so I can't predict where it's going, but my sense is that we need to provide enough cash to down stock. And how do you do that? Because if you don't, then the older generation especially is going to keep the cows because that's what they want for their insurance. That's their wealth. And so we need to have more of a balanced portfolio. But that means we need to provide jobs where cash is good, where people have real salaries, and there need to be more than one earner so that the kids can amortize the costs of paying their parents and their extended family back so they can generate a middle class. So it's not going to be easy. And that's why I say what we're doing is like a stone that creates a ripple. Can we capture that ripple and sustain it and get it to multiply so that real income can come into these communities? And that's the $64,000 question. I mean, we just don't know. But at least we as conservation biologists, by starting this route, we buy some time. But we shouldn't think sequentially. We need the parallel process. I should be talking to the CEOs of Barclays or someplace, not Barclays right now, but in general, to try to find ways to generate more wealth here. Okay.
Let's take one more question.
In the study you do you lose lots of animals in the savannas from preying lions and other things like that?
I'm sorry, I missed the question. Go ahead.
Do you have attrition of the population of the zebras that you study from animals like lions and other things like that?
We do counts and we do mark recapture so we can look at the vital rates and the dynamics. Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, of the decrease in the number.
Well, the plain zebras are not. Plain zebras are thriving. They went down during one of the really big drought followed by the El Nino rains. The numbers went down, but they've all recovered. The lion numbers stay pretty constant at about 6 per 100 square kilometer. It's not clear why. I suspect there's poisonings. I suspect there's illicit control of the lion populations, because there's no reason why those numbers are not going up. Wild dog numbers are exploding. Rosie Woodruff, who most of you know, who was here before going to Zoological Society of London, there were no wild dogs, how many years ago? 7 years ago? None. Now there's 350 wild dogs in Laikipia and 16 packs, and you can see wild dogs every day now. Okay, so wild dogs are just phenomenal. And the dik-diks have disappeared almost. I mean, there used to be dik-diks all over the place. Now dik-dik numbers are going down, so I suspect the wild dogs are going to shift their diet and start eating some of the larger prey like impala. So it is a fluid community. It's changing. It changes naturally. It also changes by our activities. Okay.
Thanks, Dan.
Okay, thank you.